Today we have Christina Embree on the podcast. Welcome, Christina. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, before we jump in, we're going to talk intergenerational ministry, but give us like an introduction to yourself and what you do, and then we'll jump in and talk about that.
Sure. So my name is Christina Embree, and I am the founder and director of Refocus Ministry. We're a nonprofit that's committed to connecting generations at church and at home. And we like to connect generations in meaningful relationships so that they can experience lifelong discipleship. I also serve at our church as the next gen pastor and with our denomination as the minister of generational discipleship. So I'm local, and I get to talk to people all over the world through Refocus.
What denomination is your church part of that you work with?
Yeah, we're the Brethren in Christ, which is an Anabaptist denomination. We've got about 250 congregations in the U.S., but we're actually the majority of our population is not in the United States or in North America. It's overseas.
Okay, that's cool. And I would imagine Refocus spans across denominations. You probably work with all kind of churches, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And all over the globe. I love the fact that I can do things through Zoom. So this week I felt like I went on a world tour. I've been in Canada, I've been in South Korea, I've been in Australia. So it's been really neat to
That's awesome.
just connect with people in all kinds of churches, all different denominations.
That's fun. You're like, take your computer outside so I can see where you are in Canada or South Korea. Although Canada's probably really cold. I don't know. Show me some snow and some beautiful snow-capped areas, and show me these different places.
I'm always telling them that they're welcome to bring me in person. I would be happy to come visit them.
Yes, I would love to work with you on site. That would be wonderful. That's cool. That's cool. Well, let's talk about intergenerational ministry. And I think, anybody that hears that probably has like some idea of it, but like, how do you define it? And then we'll even talk about what does it look like in churches that you see? Because I think, again, that's probably where people's minds go. But how do you define intergenerational ministry?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that I get asked a lot, because I think depending on which circle you're in, a lot of people just hear kids ministry with adults. And that is not what we mean by intergenerational ministry. I would define it sort of the way I just did. An opportunity to connect generations in meaningful relationships for lifelong discipleship. I really think that that's the key of what intergenerational ministry is. And how that plays out is different for each church, each context, each community. I will say that a lot of people do try to use interchangeably the idea of multi-generational and intergenerational. And here's how I describe the difference for that. It's the difference between soup and stew. So whenever you have a soup that has individual pieces, it is one soup, but the pieces don't intermingle with one another, right? You've got big chunks of carrots and potatoes, and the meat is separate. But a lot of times with a stew, they'll actually take all those vegetables and blend them together. So you get like a thicker stew. And so that's kind of what we would look at with intergenerational. It's blended in that when you look at something that's happening, you can't say, oh, there's the adults over there, there's the kids over there, there's the teens there. It's actually like, oh, here's a group of people who are engaging in something together. And that's what our goal is. That's what our aim is, to help churches be able to find those spaces where all the ages can do something together, whether it's prayer or service or worship, a space where they are just one people learning and serving and working together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the words relationships and discipleship were the two words that stuck out to me. Like if you just, narrowed down to those two things intergenerationally, that makes sense because then it's more broad. Yeah. There's so many different ways that can work. Why do you think this matters?
Absolutely. Well, I think it matters mostly because of our Great Commission. So Jesus left us with a Great Commission. He said, go into all the world and make disciples. And I truly, honestly believe that starts in our backyard. And we know, those of us in ministry know all of the current trends in the church and the declining membership, especially in the rising generations. And my big question with that is, then are we making disciples? And so when we look at scripture, we see a very clear pattern of what we call generational discipleship, where faith is being passed from one generation to another. And we see it in human stories, people like Eli and Samuel, and Naomi and Ruth, and Paul and Timothy. We see it in how Jesus passed on his faith to others, in relationships with them, in meaningful relationships. We read about it in the Psalms. It's just all through scripture is that part of making a disciple is having a relationship with them. It's really hard to do when our ages don't intermingle with one another. So one generation to another becomes really difficult when the generations don't have spaces where they're connecting, aren't forming relationships, and then where is the space to pass on faith that way?
Yeah, so I have a few questions probably related to maybe a bigger question. What does this look like in churches? Like, part of me wants to know what's it look like in other countries, so we'll get there. But just in general,
Yeah.
what does this look like? Because even as you described that, part of me thinks um, most churches have probably some measure of this in a small way, just because they have, let's take kids, for example, volunteers leading kids, and they come from different generations. You might have 20-some-year-old
Yeah.
leading them, or 50-some-year-old leading them, or whatever. And so, same with youth ministry. So there's like some aspect of that there. Now, of course, they're separated in these environments. They're separated from their own parents usually because they're in their own thing. But anyway, what does this
Yeah.
look like in churches? And maybe we can explore the different pieces of that.
Yeah, so that's actually what I did for my doctoral research. I worked with churches. I got to do case studies where we looked at where the opportunities were for connection to happen, if those places turned into relationships, and if those relationships led to discipleship. And what we found is that in churches, there's a lot of places for connection. And what you described, I would describe more as connection than relationship. There's a place for people to connect with one another in the lobby, in the hallway, in the sanctuary, saying hi, catching up. But our goal would be to move those things from that connection to a relationship. And really, really key for younger generations is that they have relationships with people that they don't perceive as having to have a relationship with them, right?
Sure.
We know that the people who teach Sunday school, that they're volunteers. But to kids, they have to be friends with like these people who come into our room. They have to be my friend because they're my teacher. So that same friend coming to them and saying, hey, when's your soccer game this week? I want to come watch you play, takes it from that connection to a relationship. Like, I am seeking to have a friendship with you, not because I have to, not because it's my day to volunteer, but because I genuinely want to have a friendship with you. And in those spaces, we begin to find that that allows for conversations that go deeper than the lesson and really into passing of the faith from one generation to another. So practically, how does that play out? I really think I always tell churches to start in two places. First, prayer, specifically intercessory prayer. Praying for one another, all ages can do that. And I love Tony Souter's Pray For Me campaign, which you can find online. It connects youth and kids to 3 prayer partners of different generations, and they pray for each other for an entire school year. And I have watched that transform church culture and community. Because when you start praying for somebody, you want to be like, hey, Nick, what do you got going on this week? How can I pray for you? And that's beyond the typical, hi, see you later connection. And then the other one is service. Having churches serve together on mission. It's a really big part of intergenerational studies, is recognizing leaders and students, that we both need to be teachers and students. And so going into a place where we can serve on mission with one another, we learn from each other, we experience life together. And honestly, it just really is a powerful place. So practically, those are 2 places where I see it lived out the most.
Do you think, as you're talking about, part of me is thinking like, so some churches, I grew up in a church in Sunday school, and my wife and I taught Sunday school, 7th grade Sunday school when we were younger. And I always point back to that as like, well, that was an example of where we weren't great leaders because we were everything. We were the teachers, we were the hosts, we did the hospitality, they weren't small groups, but, we were providing care. And, it's hard for one person to do all those things, which is why I'm a big fan of like the large group, small group model and kids and students, where like some people are teaching, some are their small group leaders. And so when you're talking about that, I think about our small group leaders for kids and for student ministry, and they are showing up predictably there every week and leading this group of kids. And then we do love for them to invest in them outside the church, and many of them do show up at soccer games. Like I think of our one small group leader that'll print like a oversized picture of the kid's face and like hold it on the sideline or whatever, which is hilarious. And so it's interesting though, because like I would say we got there more from the small group leader idea, like Lead Small, the book from Orange, and it talks about, all the things that you're talking about, the connection that kids need, or I think of Fuller Youth with their 5, every kid needs 5 other influences in life kind of thing. And so, but I don't know that intentionally we've got there because we've said, hey, we need intergenerational ministry. You know what I mean? Like it was like we got to that maybe similar place, but then there might be other things that are missing. So like if a church is, let's say a church is doing that, they've got volunteers who are investing in kids and students, and they are their small group leaders. Like they know them, they know their families. They, you know, we all want the leaders that show up at outside church and everything, but you know, some do, some don't. That's harder. What else could that church do with intergenerational ministry on top of that to even take it further?
Yeah, well, I definitely think prayer and service are two areas that would be outside of that. That would include, you likely have 6 generations in your church right now, from oldest to youngest. And I always recommend that when you're creating a new program or you're putting something together, to try to have at least 3 generations present. A past generation, someone who's looking past, a present generation, and a future generation, and to use that as your thumbnail. So that's not really a 1 and 2 people, a volunteer or a small group leader and child, but it's a coming together of multiple generations, and to have a singular mission. We're going to pray for one another for a year. We're going to serve in this community garden. We're going to, tomorrow our church is doing a walk for warmth through the city. We're going to walk together, all ages, with the intention of sharing this experience together. And then I think what you brought up about sticky faith is really important, because it's 5. It's not 1 or 2. Yeah. What their research found was that a child, a youth, thrived when they had at least 5 adults in meaningful relationship with them, at least 5 adults who were forming relationships with them. And so 1 or 2 is great. 5 is amazing. So creating spaces for that to happen, like a shared meal once a month, where you say to people, don't sit with who you came with, and make sure that there's people who are 10 years older and 10 years younger for you at that table. And immediately you've created a situation where, over a shared meal, where you can provide some questions so they can get to know each other, you've helped establish some new relationships that could grow.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, like the service part, do you think having like students or even kids, I know some churches that'll have kids serve in volunteer roles within the church, but certainly students, a lot of churches have middle school, high school serve, in volunteer roles then where they're around other generations even more in a sense, because they might serve with them, you know. Does that help get at that too, or is it more like it's both and do service outside the church, like do all these things, you know, find different ways they can bring them together all over?
Well, I can tell you what our research showed. Our research showed, and I'm going to give some terminologies here. We kind of made them up, but I stole them from sociology. But this idea of thin intergenerationality and thick intergenerationality. So thin would mean there are some spaces where we see intergenerational relationships growing, and thick is where we see a lot of overlap. And so churches that had thin intergenerationality would point to 1 or 2 places that they would say, oh yeah, we have kids serving in service and mentoring on the soundboard. And yeah, we have Sunday school teachers that reach out to the kids. That had a thicker intergenerationality would have multiple places where they would say, oh, and here, not just in our institutional setup. We have a youth chair on all our committees. We, institutionally involve a senior chair, all generations, but also in our space, we have 4 places in the church that we encourage all generations to be present. And here's how we do it. And so they would have all these things. And so I think what we need to think about isn't checking a box, but creating a culture that is constantly thinking, how are we helping people connect? How are we helping them develop meaningful relationships? How are we resourcing them for the work of discipleship and sharing their faith stories? And if we went into all of our spaces and programs and events with that mindset, it would help us to create intentionally that kind of a flow, especially if we just tell people, this is our goal. We want you to connect with one another. We're hoping that you get to know one another, you form some meaningful relationships with one another, and ultimately that you share with each other what Jesus is doing in your life, has done for you, and will do in the future. Yeah. It's as simple as that. Each and every, that becomes your lens through which you are thinking about discipleship.
Yeah, because you could, as I'm thinking about it, the thin to thick comparison, a lot of churches would have thin if they care about small groups, if they care about like the sticky faith idea, if their students serve, like you would just have that. Now, again, I don't think they went into it thinking, hey, intergenerational ministry, let's make sure, I think it was more like, how do we best serve kids and students? Let's get them in
Right.
relationships with peers and with great leaders. And, how do we help grow their faith? Let's get them serving, and they just happen to be serving with adults, obviously, kind of thing. And what you're talking about is more of like a bigger mindset of, hey, let's have these generations mixed together in all ways, and in the church, and not just, as a byproduct, so to speak, of these other things that we're already doing. I'm curious, what does it look like in other countries? Or, like when you're
It's
coaching a
really,
church here versus like South Korea, I
yeah,
mean, like it's got to look different, right?
it is. It has less to do with the country than it has to do with the culture, I would say. So Australia, New Zealand, they look a lot like the United States, UK, Canada, a lot like what I see here, Western Protestant. But when you go into Hispanic cultures and Asian cultures, Indian cultures, there is a much higher, African cultures especially, a much higher emphasis on the idea of a village, of a community, and of a family. You don't shame your family, you bring your family honor. Everything has to do with the family name. They're all up in each other's business. A lot different than here in our Western culture, where we tend to highly value individualism and privacy.
Yeah.
Um, and so the discussion is different. Interestingly, I would not say it's more challenging or easier. I would say it's just different. They have other things that cause challenge, like the way they treat the elderly, very different than here. They're much more honored. They're honorific. They are put in a place of esteem, and they get listened to a lot more. And children are less so considered places that we can learn from and grow from, even though Christ
Mm-hmm.
put a child right in the middle of all of us and
Yeah.
said, be like this
Like
one,
this.
learn what the kingdom of God is like from this one. And so there's different challenges. How does it play out? They're really quick to jump on community events and intermingling. What they're less quick to jump on is learning from one another. Everybody, there's a lot of falling into the older generation teaches down to the younger generation.
Mm-hmm.
And part of an effective and thick intergenerationality is that we are student and learners together. We learn about life from one another.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
yeah.
So I think about, I'm sure a component of intergenerational ministry, like a lot of what we talked about, is what is the church doing to mix these generations, have them do things together. And then part of that, of course, would be helping parents lead their kids, which again is a popular topic among children's and youth ministry for the last number of years. So how does that fit in here, and how would a church that's doing intergenerational ministry equip parents and caregivers for discipleship?
Oh, yeah. So that's a big question, but here is a big answer. Parents and caregivers in this day and age are pretty overwhelmed. Kids have extracurriculars like never before. Most parents, most families are dual income families, and getting their kids to church can sometimes be difficult. One of the things I think churches often fail at is when our families aren't in church for sports or some extracurricular activity, our tendency is to be a little bit more shaming and offering them guilt and disappointment. And I think it would be more advantageous if we came around them as a community, that we sent them out with our blessing and said, hey, go tell the people you're going to be around about Jesus. Come tell us the stories of how God showed up, and really incorporated into our church life a support of that rather than a shaming. But secondly, parents and caregivers need to know they have a community behind them. There is nothing more blessing to me than one of the adults in our church coming up to me and saying, hey, yesterday I hung out with Caleb and this happened. Or, I just want to let you know I'm praying for Hannah. Those things as a parent are so essential. So making sure that we have created the spaces necessary for parents to hear from other members of the congregation, not the pastors, not the Sunday school teachers, but the grandma sitting in the row beside them and the greeter at the door who sees their kids every week, to just say, you're doing a great job parenting. I'm praying for your kids. You're not alone in this. And then the second thing is, I think resourcing our parents. Sometimes I think when we think resourcing our parents, what we do is we give them a lot of devotionals and handouts. And let's be honest, we know a lot of those things don't make it to the door. But I think one way we could resource our parents is by teaching them how to have faith conversations at home. having a time in your church where the whole family comes together and they learn how to have a faith talk. They learn together how to open the Bible and read scripture together, that they practice it in a community, and they are given that resource so that when they're at home, this isn't a new or novel thing. This is something they've practiced as a family. They know the expectation, and they've had opportunity to grow. So I think one big part of resourcing parents is giving them tools so that they're actually able to do the work that they're called to do in a way that's not off-putting to them.
Mm-hmm. Last one I want to ask about is volunteers. Like if you're, moving this way as a church, you're equipping parents, maybe you are leaning into like volunteers that are connected to kids and students more and they know them, and obviously going past connection to relationship as you talked about. But like what else does a church do, should a church do to help volunteers kind of get on board with this model?
Yeah, well, I think definitely just the message of connection, relationship, discipleship is huge. And just letting them know, yes, you volunteer on the fourth Sunday, but all week long, you have the opportunity to pray for these kids that are in your church, to reach out to them. But my big thing, and I call it the 10-second touch, is when the parents come to pick up that child and you're the one greeting them and giving them, is just to have this little conversation with them. Hey, I just wanted to let you know that Johnny showed a lot of kindness today. And I know that's because you're teaching him how to be kind. And he had a lot of questions about this Bible verse. So maybe this week you guys can read it together, maybe pray about it, and then you can explain to him what's going on. Have a great week. And what you've done in that short little conversation is said, you're a good parent. I know your kid's name. And here's a way that you can have a faith conversation at home. You've given them a tool, you've resourced them, and you did it in 10 seconds. And I think volunteers are uniquely in a position to do that every week. Just imagine if you were a parent and you came to church and every week you were affirmed in your work as a parent. You knew that your kids were seen and loved and their names were known. And you had something to talk about with them at home after church instead of, what did you learn about today? Jesus. And the ultimate question, did you have fun today? Neither of those things are helping us to develop the discipleship. But, buddy, I heard you read this Bible verse today. That's awesome. Mm-hmm. Tell me about it. Yeah. Really does.
Yeah, we were just, my local children's ministry network met 2 days ago. And one of the things that was a topic of conversation of how some of our churches are using text to parents just to try to prompt those kind of conversations that have a little more to them. Even in student ministry, like you come back from a trip or a retreat and parents have a text or an email about like, hey, here's what you can ask specifically. You know what I mean? That will tie into like what they learned so that they can't just get by with it was good or, we talked about this or I don't know, whatever, keeping it general, you can make it specific. So that's interesting. That's cool. Well, tell me, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think tying it to affirmation at the same time is really helpful. Being able to say to a parent, you're doing a great job and here's something you can talk about with your kid is really just, I don't know. I think parents need to hear that.
Oh, I agree. I think every parent thinks they're failing. And that's I always say part of the magic of bringing parents together is they realize they're not as bad as they think. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, I'm not the only one whose kid this or who didn't do that or whatever. And because, social media and even just your own mind can lead you to believe, everybody else is crushing it and, you're doing terrible. And part of parenting is a lot of it is you don't feel like you're hitting the mark. So it's good to be around other people that see that too and remind you that, no, you're doing well. That's good. That's a great thought. Well, how can people connect with you, with Refocus, what you do, if they have any questions, anything like that?
Yeah, well, you can find us online, refocusministry.org, and you can email me at Christina@refocusministry.org. So I'm pretty easy to find. We're also on, I think, every social media site you can think of, except for TikTok, because I'm just not brave enough to make videos. But we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Faithly. So if you're on any of those, you can just look up Refocus Ministry and you'll find us.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. Enjoy some of your world travels via Zoom in the future. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
All right.